Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, folks. Hey, welcome to another episode of the Marketing Your Practice podcast where I get to simplify the marketing and the mindset so you, the chiropractor, can increase your income, your impact, and your enjoyment in practice too. I'm back home again. So the last episode, 273, was coming to you all the way from Limerick. I was staying in one of the student dorms there. The production value wasn't as good, the microphone wasn't as great, but I hope you liked that content in around the importance of purpose, clarifying your impact. I had some lovely feedback about it. Today we're talking really about how to deal with disappointment and really what stops us going after really big goals, what stops us implementing a marketing strategy, what stops us going after our dreams. I've had some great realizations, particularly at the end of this lacrosse World Championships, and I want to share that with you. So many of you have been wanting to know, how did Edison go at the World Lacrosse Championships? So this was the under 21 World Lacrosse Championships, and the goal of the boys, the Aussie boys, has been for 3 years for them to play off for a medal. They were very realistic about what was possible for them, and they realized that that medal was more than likely going to be a bronze medal. The Americans and the Canadians are so far ahead of the rest of the world, it's not funny. And that makes sense because it's a national game for Canada and it's a very strong game in the US as well. So the Canadian and the American boys for the last 2 years at least have been in the college system. And these boys particularly that made up that side are playing virtually as full-time athletes. They're training, playing lacrosse 3 hours a day. And when they're not doing that, they've got gym sessions for a couple of hours a day. These boys eat together breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And there's a really strong competition. And so they're very realistic around what they were likely to be playing off for was a bronze medal. When the time came that we actually played against the Americans, I think they beat us 17-2, the Canadians 16-3, or something very similar to that. We didn't even get close to them. And had they wanted to beat us by even more than that, then they really could have. But the rest of the tournament for the boys was a great success in terms of playing against other sides that they needed to beat, the Japanese, the English. They beat them comfortably. And then there is another side in here as well. Now, you'll see where all this is going. If you think, hang on, Angus, am I going to listen to a whole episode all about lacrosse? Not really. I've had a really very interesting breakthrough and some thoughts this week. We're going somewhere. We're talking about disappointment and why you might want to feel more disappointed. And why a fear in around disappointment might be actually holding you back significantly in your life. So that's where we're going with this journey. So the other team that the Aussies needed to beat is a team of American Indian boys called the Haudenosaunee. Now these boys they're not just American Indians. They come from America and Canada as well, all the way through there. And so lacrosse actually started with an Indigenous American, I hope I'm using the right terms with regards to that, I think I am. But this team is called the Haudenosaunee. It's made up of a number of different American Indian tribes. And these boys are incredibly skillful and they typically come third. But our best chance was to beat these boys. And in the pool game leading up to it, we did beat them. I think we beat them 13-7. The boys had a great game. Ed had a great game. He scored 3 wonderful goals. Got a bunch of assists, and the whole team could not have played better than they did in that game. And that is ultimately who we played in the bronze medal match. Now, the boys went into that game confident, given that they beat the Haudenosaunee early on in the tournament. They thought that they could probably replicate that. But sadly for them, they weren't in that game right from the start. The Haudenosaunee had a really brilliant game, and they were always at least 3 goals up the whole time. And any time that we really got to start to challenge, they would score quickly, and the end result of that game was 10-6. Now, here's where things get interesting. When I'm talking with people afterwards who have been so beautifully invested in Edison's journey, and they will say, how is Edison feeling? And how is the team feeling? And I would say, he's doing okay, and he's very disappointed. And it's interesting with how their reaction is with disappointment. This is what I want to talk about in this episode in terms of how you might react to when people around you are disappointed, and maybe why a fear of disappointment is holding you back. So let's, first of all, I kind of looked at what is the definition of disappointment. Now, disappointment, according to one of the online dictionaries, means being sad or displeased because someone or something has failed to fill one's hopes or expectations. So Ed and his team had expectations of a bronze medal, and they've worked very hard of it over 3 years. and they didn't realize their expectation, and so they are feeling sad and or displeased. Now, here's the interesting thing. When I tell people that Edison is displeased or disappointed, they're two, the first thing they try and do is they try and reframe it in some way. They'll say something like, oh, they shouldn't be disappointed. They came fourth in the world. And that's an extraordinary effort. Like, they're the fourth best lacrosse side under 21 in the world. And yes, they are. And yes, that is an extraordinary result. But that's not a reason not to be disappointed, okay? They will say things like they shouldn't be hard on themselves, not to take it so seriously, all those type of things. They're trying to reframe it. Now, it has me thinking about this. I ask myself this question, and some of the actual coaching I've done with clients this week since getting back is being disappointed a problem? And is it okay to be disappointed? And some of the conversations we've had from there have been nothing short of fascinating. So why, if there's an inner drive inside of you when you're thinking about Edison being disappointed, where you don't feel comfortable with that, or if you think about your children feeling disappointed, or if you think about you in the future possibly being disappointed and you want to really move away from that, let's explore that as well. The problem is not so much disappointment. The problem is what we make disappointment mean. Now, for you, maybe there's some other words that we could use inside of here, because maybe it's not disappointment, maybe it's failure, maybe it's rejection, okay? What do you make these things mean? Now, is that when I tell you that Edison is disappointed, if you make that mean that Edison's having a discussion with himself that he's not worthy, he's not good enough, he's not lovable, then I could see how disappointment is a problem. Now, I didn't tell you that that's the conversation that Edison is having. And he's not. He's not beating himself up. He's not telling himself he's not lovable or worthy or a great human being. He's disappointed because, remember, we go back to the definition. He's sad or displeased because something has not turned out the way with regards to his hopes and or expectations. So when we make disappointment mean something else, failure means something else, rejection means something else, that's the first sign if we're trying to move away from this. Now, often what happens when we're making it mean something about our value as a human being, that often leads towards some form of shame, okay? I'm not good enough, I'm a bad person. This is when we want to try and steer away from it. And it's a problem, particularly when we want to guide our children. So for those of you that are parents, there's been a great parenting lesson for me too. When we try and protect our kids from these things, we're doing it because we want to move them away from shame, and we're not showing them that disappointment can be okay. When we're trying to move away from disappointment there too, we're not seeing the inherent resilience in ourselves. That's another thing. Now, I'm not saying that we do this on purpose with regards to how people are talking about Edison at all, but these are just the default conversations that we have. Because what it's saying is that I don't want Edison to be disappointed because I don't think he can cope with it. It's another way of saying that, or looking at somebody as though they're a victim. Now, this is never a great way to look at somebody, to put somebody in that victim way of doing it, because it tends to point them towards a powerless direction. And particularly when we do this with ourselves, instead of arguing for our strengths, our greatness, our abilities, our resilience, what we do is that we tend to argue for our victimhood instead. So when we don't see our inherent resilience, that's another reason why we're scared of disappointment as well. So what are the consequences of being fearful in around disappointment? And I think here, as I was thinking about this week and really preparing it for this episode, this is where I started to see just how enormous the consequences are. If we are fearful of disappointment, if we're have fears in around rejection and or failure, it's one of the reasons that really holds us back, okay? If we're not prepared to risk disappointment, what this means is that we're not ever likely to set big goals, because what we know is that on the journey towards big goals, there will be disappointment. Very rarely in life do we do anything that's hugely worthwhile where there's not some challenges along the way, where there won't be rejection or failure, and where there won't be disappointment. So that's the first consequence that kind of happens as well. We know that big goals require disappointment, and if we're not prepared to feel disappointment, we're not going to go after the big goals away. This is also the drive away from negative emotions as well, gives them way more power than what they need to be. We live in a world nowadays that is all about a drive towards pleasure and a movement away from fear. And when we do that, a movement away from fear and pain, towards pleasure and away from fear and pain. And we put way too much weight on, there's nothing great about feeling disappointment. There's nothing great about feeling rejection, but I believe inherently you have everything within you to get through this. And we go back to what I said to begin with. We need to then have a conversation around what we're making it mean. Ultimately, the consequences of being fearful in around things like disappointment means that we stagnate growth because growth comes from stress and challenge. And if we look at it at the most basic physiological point of view, is that in order for a muscle to grow, we need to break it down. Microscopically, when we look at a muscle after it's been weight trained, there are micro tears and trauma there. But the body has within it an intelligence, this same intelligence that you and I are calling upon when we adjust somebody's spine, to really build from that stress and make it stronger. I believe that this challenge that Edison is going through at the moment, the disappointment from here, that this will make him stronger. Now, it's still hard for me as a parent to watch my beautiful boy feel disappointed, but I know that he's resilient and he's strong and that he will really learn from this. Without disappointment, the world would miss out on some of the most extraordinary human beings that ever existed. One of my role models, there too, Michael Jordan, his motivation that ultimately drove him to be one of the greatest basketballers of all time came after the enormous disappointment of being cut from his school basketball side. That fueled him for that summer afterwards to literally never have the basketball leave his hand, for him to train harder, to focus more, and to be single-mindedly driven towards being the best he possibly can. Without disappointment, that doesn't happen. I love to think about often the story, the fable of a parent who's with their child, and as they're walking along, they come across a cocoon, and starting to break the way out of that cocoon is a butterfly. And the child can see that the butterfly is really, really struggling to get out of this cocoon. There's a real difficulty that's coming from it. And the child reaches out to grab the cocoon so it can break the butterfly out to ease the journey. But the parent, the mother, says to the child, we mustn't do that, because if you make it easy for the butterfly to get out of the cocoon, the butterfly won't develop the strength in its wings that allows it to fly. It's the struggle and the challenge of the exit out of the cocoon that ultimately allows the butterfly to fly as well. And so the same is true for disappointment that might happen to you with your practice, the big goals that you have, with the relationship goals that you have, with the disappointment that you might experience with individual patients. If we're not prepared to go through some of this struggle, we can't get the results. And this is also a conversation that we should very much be having with our patients. We need to be letting them know that it's okay for things to be difficult. You have hardwired into you a neurology that's very used to doing difficult things. So in essence, the first big challenge with disappointment is not the disappointment itself. The challenge really is, what are we making disappointment mean? Now, depending on whether we have a growth or a fixed mindset, coming back to Carol Dweck's work here, a fixed mindset would tell us that the disappointment is final. We won't learn anything about it. This reminds me of another point too. One of the other things that we do is that when we have this over-obsession about wanting to keep away from disappointment, it tells me that you are overly focused on the outcome, not the journey. We've all experienced times when we've gone after wonderful goals and we've achieved them. We've got there and we've told ourselves, is this it? Now, part of the reason we've done that is we've been misled to what goals are about. The reason we go after big goals is because who it makes us as a human being. Now, this, over the last few years, has made Edison an incredibly dedicated, focused, committed individual. Those things are with him, regardless of the fact whether he won the bronze medal or not. He's become a better athlete. He's been better organized with his time. He's been focused. He's shown himself that he can do difficult things under incredibly challenging circumstances. And so if we are overly focused on just the outcome, that's another thing that we need to kind of really steer away from. So what should we do when we're disappointed? So if you're feeling disappointed, if you're feeling rejected, feeling like you failed, what should you do? The first is this. I remember a number of years ago when I was studying some of the work in around the Enneagram, that one of the guys was talking about one of the most valuable skills that we can have as a human being is self-awareness. And at the time I thought, maybe that's an exaggeration. But as I go on and I think about things, I tend to agree with him more and more. Self-awareness is the absolute key. It is self-awareness that allows us to see that I am being disappointed at the moment, and that then allows us to look into what the next steps are. So here's the first thing. A decade ago, if I was feeling disappointed, what I would have done is what many of you were doing when I talked to you about Edison, is I would have flipped it in some way. I would have said, well, it's amazing that I've made it to the World Championships in the first place, and fourth is really good. I would have looked for a positive silver lining in around the outside of it. Now, this is a challenge because it moved me away from just feeling free to actually experience disappointment. So if we are having these emotions come up, the first thing we should do is feel them. Okay, that's important. I believe that our neurology won't give us a feeling that we're not able to cope with. So think about it. If the neurochemicals are there, if the bonding sites are there, then we have millions of years of evolution that there's no mistake there. So if I'm feeling disappointed, I'm meant to actually feel that way. So there are multiple ways that you can process and feel that emotion. The most simple and what works really for me is to actually welcome it in, to sit and breathe. And instead of resisting it and pushing it back, is to feel it more. For some people, what can work is to write and journal about it, to describe what it is that you're feeling, to imagine yourself literally hovering up above your body and describe what it is. I feel tightness in my chest, my breath is shallow, my head feels cotton woolly, I feel like crying, and to describe what it is that actually feels like. Sometimes just talking about it with a friend can be helpful, but for me, breath and feeling it, opening up. Where is it? Is it my stomach? Is it my head? Is it my chest? Is it my heart? And how can I actually feel it more? And very often, within as little as 2 or 3 minutes, I can breathe through, I can process an emotion there too. The other thing I want you to do is I want you to acknowledge your humanness. And maybe sometimes this can be because failure is part of the human experience. Okay, as I talked about this before, we're definitely not going to have a big life and not have failures and disappointments along the way. And so there is, to some sense, an arrogance to thinking that you can go through life and not have disappointment. We need to acknowledge that this is part of the actual human experience. If it's continuing to stick around, now, depending on the disappointment and the sadness and what it's coming from, there will be a time where it's no longer helpful. If Edison still was weighed down by the weight of disappointment, at the moment, as I'm recording this, he's traveling around Amsterdam. I dare say he's probably not thinking about it a lot next week when he's in Berlin. But if it was still holding him back in a few weeks' time, then we'd want to have a conversation in around, buddy, what are you making this mean? So that might be a conversation that you want to have after you've breathed through it, if that's not made any difference to it. Maybe it's, what am I making this actually mean? The fact that is the disappointment actually shifting into shame? One of the things that many of us are not great at are differentiating our emotions, really clarifying, what am I feeling at the moment? Am I feeling disappointment or am I feeling shame? So having a look in and letting and investigating, what is it that you're actually telling yourself? The other thing too to really think about is that when we break down our class of emotions into what we might refer to as positive emotions and negative emotions, and I don't even really like using those words, they're two, but the two different groups of emotions allow for contrast. And it is through disappointment that we get to feel the euphoria of victory. Now, without disappointment, we can't experience that. Without ugliness, we don't know what beauty is. So the contrast in emotions is incredibly important. Our nervous system works by contrast, understanding. When we go back to very old Eastern philosophy of the yin and the yang, for thousands of years, they've known that within the good is the bad and within the bad is the good, and that there is this continuum that runs through things. And the challenges of life are wanting it to be all one way and not the other. But we can, when we feel the disappointment and we feel the realness and the rawness of it, it is that very experience there that also allows us to feel the euphoria of victory. And so that's another reminder. I want to share with you and finish up this episode with one of my favorite quotes. There's a beautiful book that, if this idea of dealing with this stuff really intrigues you, then Brené Brown's book of Daring Greatly and the Power of Vulnerability might be something that you want to explore. In that, she spends a lot of time really breaking down one of Teddy Roosevelt's quotes called The Man in the Arena. And I have spoken about that beforehand. I want to read it to you now and to think about it underneath the perspective that, or the umbrella that we've just talked about with regards to disappointment. So here's the first part, what Teddy goes on to say. He says, it's not the critic who counts. It's not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, and who comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. So that point there towards the end of this first bit of it, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. Our world has tried to tell us now, wrongly, that we can have effort without shortcoming. And part of this has led to the fact that we want participation awards for our kids for 4th place and 5th place. We don't want to let them know, as Theodore talks about inside of this, is that there is no effort without error and shortcoming. So let's continue on with that as well. It says, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best in the end knows the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Now it's that end bit there that moves me so deeply, and at times literally terrifies me. When we get to the end of our lives, it won't be the disappointment of trying and failing that will torment us. What will be there will be the fact that we never tried. And that's what he says, at worst, if he fails, at least while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. So, disappointment is not what you want to be steering away from. Failure is not what you want to be steering away from. Rejection is not what you want to be steering away from. What you want to be steering away from is what you are making these things. A fear of these type of emotions is stopping you from living the most wonderful life that you can possibly have. The goal is for you to remain open to these, to experience more of them, because the more of these emotions that you are prepared to experience, the wider your life will become, the bigger your life will become, and the more of the magnificence inside of you will actually be able to express. Dare greatly, my beautiful friends, and don't be steering away from disappointment. It's okay to feel disappointed. Until next time, thanks for all that you do. Keep saving lives. Remember, your community so desperately needs you to step up, maybe even to dare greatly too. See you back here real soon. Bye. If you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, you have to come and check out my Community Influencer Program. It's my monthly coaching program where we take all this material and I'll work with you to help you apply it, implement it, and systemize it. The Community Influencer Group Coaching Program is designed to help you increase your practice income, impact, and enjoyment. Join me over at anguspyke.com/join. That's anguspyke.com/join. I'd love to see you there.